Hey, it's on. How about that? I said it's on. How about that? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, or ladies and germs, time to begin our class this morning. I'll give you a warning. I opened the bedroom window last night. Now my nose is running and I'm coughing. And this morning, first thing right off the bed, I sneezed 4 or 5 times. So I guess having that window open last night, but it sure felt good in that bedroom. It's nice and cool. Bundled up in the covers. Didn't want to get up this morning. My wife had to wake me up to turn the alarm clock off. That's how bad it was. Okay, we're about finished with the book of Acts. We're in chapter 28. Now, I'm supposed to teach about 3 more weeks after this, or 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few verses today and a few verses next week, and we'll just drag it out, because I don't want to sit down and have to prepare another whole bunch of lessons just for 3 weeks. Oh, either that or I can let Gene just take over early. Okay, we're going to start in chapter 28, and we're going to spend a little more time than what we normally would on this chapter. Not to drag it out, but because of the place where Paul is at. This place called Malta has got a very interesting history. And they've got a lot of temples and a lot of traditions, and a lot of things have happened to these people over the centuries. And these people have had a very, very rough time over the centuries. They're one of these places that everybody in that part of the world has conquered at one time or another. As a matter of fact, the Arabs in about 360 BC, there's Arab warriors that actually invaded the island. They killed all but about 20 or 25% of the people. They destroyed everything on the island, and the ones that didn't get killed fled to Sicily. Okay? Now, these people came back and repopulated the island after the Arabs had left, because the Arabs didn't leave anything. Matter of fact, they had a second Arab ruler that invaded the island, and he invaded it and he left because the historian or the guy that was recording his exploits, I guess you could call him a historian, said there wasn't anything left on the island. There wasn't any treasure, there wasn't any buildings, there wasn't any people. So, he couldn't say he conquered the island because there wasn't anything there. So they packed up and left and went back to where they came from. So it's a very interesting place. Now in verse 1 of chapter 28, it says, "Now when they had escaped, then they found out that the island was called Malta. Some manuscripts call it Melita. Meliti. It's got several different spellings depending on which language you look at. But today we call it Malta. Now, it's right, you can see the bottom red line down in the ocean below Sicily. I've underlined the places where Paul's going today on this voyage. Rome's at the top, and then the 3 stops he makes after he leaves Malta. And the very bottom one that's underlined in red is the island of Malta. Now, it's a great big island, okay? It's 12 miles wide and 20 miles long. That's it. That's all there is. And it's basically a bunch of big pile of rocks. If you look at it on the internet and scan over it, I don't see how anybody could scratch out a living on that place. Matter of fact, there's no fresh water except for two streams that run during the wet season. They have fresh water. Sometimes they'll run year-round if they can store up enough water during the rainy season, but it doesn't have that much water. So I just can't see how people make a living on this island in times past. Now in modern days, we can compensate for things like that, but around 1 AD and times before that in the BCs, I just don't see. I just don't see how they could possibly have survived on this island, but they did. And there was one thing that it did do. They had an abundance of wildflowers. And Malta was known for its honey, wildflower honey. It was very popular. Now, it was on a trade route. If you notice the red line that Paul's traveling on this map, that is a typical trade route coming from Egypt, the Middle East, coming from Asia. Macedonia, a lot of times was bypassed because of conflicts by trading boats. But if they went through the Macedonian ports, they usually went on further north and crossed over into Italy and bypassed Malta and Sicily and that part of Italy down at the bottom. So if they're coming and they're not going to Macedonia, don't have any freight, then they would sail from Cyprus. They would sail directly to Malta, and they would make a port there. It had some great ports. It had several really good ports, and it was a very good trade city. Now, this island is on a plateau, and the plateau runs from the bottom of Sicily down to North Africa. Now, it's all underwater except for a few little islands that pop up here and there. And Malta happens to be one of the largest. Excuse me. Now, these numerous bays and harbors along Malta provide very good harbors. And from archaeologists seem to think that Malta has been inhabited from at least 6,500 BC. So that's a long time, almost since the beginning of time, 6,500 BC. Now, the shipwrecked passengers and crew were all saved alive, it says, and they found out they were on the island, okay? Now, the population of Malta aided in the rescue and building a fire received them. Now in verse 2 it says, and the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. Okay, now some translations of the Bible, like the Authorized King James, calls them barbarians, which is basically natives. We use the term barbarians today as meaning some people that are mean and bad. But in the uses in this day and time simply mean that they were foreigners, okay? Barbarians, foreigners, and foreigners generally refer to the fact that they didn't speak the same language as the people referring to them as barbarians. Now, Paul was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, Aramaic, but the people on Malta spoke the Phoenician language. How many are familiar with the Phoenicians? They were a major trading peoples. They traded all over the Mediterranean and were famous for their ships and for their trading expertise and all the things that they did. And they were very well known. So the Maltese language actually is a mixture of Phoenician and another language that has never been identified and has never been translated. Excuse me. Now, they showed them unusual kindness. Well, why would it be unusual? Well, these people were used to being taken advantage of or being invaded or overrun over the centuries, so they're always kind of skeptical of foreigners. Now, when ships came into port and they stayed in the port or port cities, that's okay. But when you have strangers to wash up on a shore that's not near an inhabited area, then that becomes suspicious and the people become suspicious of you. Okay? But they didn't speak Greek, and they didn't speak Latin or Roman. They didn't speak Aramaic or any of the other languages that the crew on this ship probably did. But apparently they was able to, y'all have to excuse me. It's really bad this morning. They were apparently able to communicate very well. Verse 3, and saying, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. Now, you know, this creates a problem right off, you know, when they see this, because these are very superstitious people. And so in verse 4 it says, so when the natives saw that the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow him to live. Now, you take that word justice, and normally we refer to that as right and wrong or getting things in the correctly under the law or something like that. But in the Maltese language, the word justice, or the word that Paul used here, justice, doesn't mean that. Justice was a Roman god. It refers to Justilia, who was the daughter and assessor of Zeus and the avenger of crime. So, it was not a Roman, but a Greek goddess, justice. So, over the years, there's probably been a number of translations of the Bible that use the word justice, and the people didn't really understand what justice meant in this context. And it wasn't justice like we would expect it to be under the law. It was a Greek god, mythological god that didn't exist, but she was the daughter of Zeus. And that was her job, was to avenge criminals. People that committed a crime, she would punish them for it. Okay, verse 5, it says, but he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now, these are very superstitious people, right? They didn't have the science that we had today, and being on the island of Malta, they were fairly well isolated. They didn't have a history of mingling socially or intermingling or traveling back and forth between Italy or Sicily or North Africa or any other place. They remained fairly well isolated, so they kept their gods, heavy Greek influence, and through mythology of the conquering when they were conquered by the Greeks. But their superstition, they had not even enjoyed the educational upgrades, you might call them, from Greece and Rome and other parts of the world that were becoming more advanced in civilization. These people were still basically fairly well on the primitive side, especially when it comes to superstition. So they thought that he was a god. Now, the religion today in Malta, can anybody guess what it is? You would think it would be Muslim, right? Because the Arabs had conquered it a number of times over the centuries, but it's not. It's Catholicism. These people are basically Catholics today. Now, how the Maltese culture becoming entrenched in this religion, I didn't go into that in detail, but most likely during the first, second centuries, these people were becoming more open to outside ideas, and we're also going to find out that Paul's going to run into some Christians, okay, and further on in this chapter. And he's going to run into some Christians in a place where nobody has been to preach yet. So where did these Christians come from? Well, if you remember in Acts chapter 2, you know, on the day of Pentecost, it said there was people there from all over the world. So, and considering that Paul had already made 3 journeys, 3 voyages around the Mediterranean, not going to Sicily or Italy. He had never been to those places. But he'd been to all over Macedonia, and he'd been all over Asia, preaching on his missionary journeys. So in this day and time, people traveled a lot more than what we would think today. We think, well, these people were all what? We think, well, they just were born and raised here and never went anywhere else. But that's not true. As we found out earlier in our studies, these people went on vacations. These people traveled. These people travel for business. They travel for pleasure. They traveled to relocate to find better jobs or occupations. They did everything that we do today, that people in the world do today. People in the world today, they travel from what? Country to country, don't they? We have people coming into this country. We have people leaving this country. We have people coming into Europe and leaving Europe. They all have their reasons for traveling. Pleasure, business, personal. So everybody's got reasons. And this is not anything new. It's been going on for thousands of years. Thousands of years people have been traveling. So it won't be surprising when Paul runs into Christians. We just don't know where they learned about the Christian religion, where they were baptized or how they were converted. But going on into verse 7, now in that region there was an estate, the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. Okay, now he's going to put them up for 3 whole days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. Okay? Now, it's interesting that they put him up for 3 whole days. Now, this is kind of unusual for these people to show this kind of what you might call compassion towards these people. Okay, first off. Now, remember, how many people were on the ship? 276. So they put up 276 people for 3 days. Now, that means they provided a place for them to sleep. They provided food for them. May have even had to provide some clothing or other necessities for them. 276 people. How many of us today could take in 276 people for 3 days and take care of them? Not many of us, right? So this man had to be very wealthy. And so it took care of him. Now, Publius was a chief, and we know from historical records that he was a very important man in Malta. As a matter of fact, archaeologists have found inscriptions on the island, and they give him an official title, okay? So Publius was an important official on the island of Malta, so that means that he probably didn't have to put them all up at his place, right? He being an official, a governor, or whatever his position was, could have asked or told other people in the government, says we need to take care of these people, find places for them to rest and feed them and take care of them for a few days. Okay. Now, fever and dysentery. This is, we don't have these problems today so much in our country. Back then, it was caused by drinking infected milk or bad milk. And it's interesting that Luke actually uses the word dysentery. This is a medical term that we still use today. And if you've been in the military, especially during World War I or World War II or the Korean War, it wasn't uncommon for dysentery to infect the troops in those days. And it's just simply because it's a bacteria that's caused from ingesting milk or other food items that make you sick. Now, after Paul healed Publius' father, in verse 9 it says, when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. Now, this gives you a good example of how one Christian act, healing his father, okay? And all of a sudden you got all these people hear about it and they want to come and they want to be healed too. So what's Paul going to do? Is he just going to make them well and let them go on? I don't think so. Paul was a preacher, wasn't he? These people come to get healed. He's going to talk to them about Jesus. He's going to talk to them about being converted to Christianity. And it's not like Paul to just say, yeah, I'll make you well, y'all go on your way, okay? He's going to teach them about Jesus. So God provided a great opportunity for Paul by putting him on this island. And even though today we see it mainly as a Catholic religion, we have to know that they had the opportunity to become Christians early, around 60 AD. These people had the opportunity to hear about Jesus and be converted to Christianity. And that has carried on since 60 AD. Their religion, Christian religion, may not be the one we agree with, but it's still a Christian religion, right? And it doesn't believe in the Muslim religion or the Hindu religion or mythology or anything like that from the Greeks or the Romans. So they had the opportunity to become Christians, to learn about Christianity early, and somehow or another they've managed to maintain that over the centuries, for many, many centuries. Now in verse 10 it says, and they also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided us with such things as was necessary. Now, so why would they provide them with all this stuff, knowing that they didn't have any way to pay for it? All the freight and everything on the ship had been lost, right? Most of it, or may have been able to salvage a little bit of it, who knows, but I doubt it. Okay, so these people were healed. They got to hear about Jesus, and they were thrilled about it, and they become benevolent. They were willing to give Paul and 266 other people supplies and things that they needed. They honored them. They appreciated what they brought to them, the healing, the Word of God, and all this great stuff that they thought they treasured it. So they honored them by providing them with everything. You got anything you want to say?
Yeah, and I like this part of the scripture because it supports what Jesus said in Mark to the 11 before he ascended into heaven. So if you go to Mark chapter 16, beginning in 15, he said to them, go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons.
Is that Mark 10?
Mark 16.
Mark 10? In Mark 10 also it talks about what Christ expected of Christians as far as being benevolent. Chapter 10, verse 8, I believe it is. Now, they didn't build these people, did they? It's not like Paul to build people. He may ask if he was in need, he would write to his fellow Christians and ask for aid. But he's not going to tell these people, look, y'all got to pay for what we did. But he's not doing that, okay? These were gifts of appreciation, of love that they provided for Paul and 266 other people that was aboard this ship. Okay, let's move on to verse 11. After 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship, whose figurehead was the twin brothers, which had wintered at the island. Now, Malta was a good place to winter. We talked about the cyclones that came across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa, the hot winds that come off the desert and mixed with the cold winds coming from the north. Just like it does here. You know, we get the hot winds off of Africa, the hurricanes come across the Atlantic, and they come across the warm waters, and then they collide with the cold air on the continents, and then what do you got? You got hurricanes, right? And that's the reason a lot of ships, when they were sailing from Cyprus or from the Middle East to Italy or Sicily, they would winter at islands like Malta. And Malta was a good place, so they had so many different harbors that it was a popular place for the ships to winter out, wait out the winter. Now, you notice it says ship of Alexandria. What was the first ship that Paul sailed on his way to Rome? A ship from Alexandria, wasn't it? So this is the second ship from Alexandria, which shows you Alexandria being in Egypt, shows you how wide the trading network was at this time without ever going into it in detail. You can see it was a very expanded sea trade from port to port, from city to city. So now the sign was the twin brothers. The sign means it was the masthead on the ship. Has anybody seen the old ships that's got the mermaid or something mounted on the front of it? Sailing ships. This one had the twin heads mounted on it. So what were the twin heads? Okay, their names are Castor and Pollux. Castor and Pollux. Okay, they are the twin sons of the god Jupiter in Greek mythology. And we have a constellation today that's named after them. Does anybody know what that is? Gemini is named after the twins, which is the Zeus god's twin sons. Now, of course, that's all in mythology. They didn't really exist, but the Greeks believed in them. And it's sort of a coincidence here that both ships carrying Paul were from Alexandria. The twin brothers was the name of the figurehead, not only on the new ship, but Rhegium, the second port of call on the way to Rome. Their figurehead was also the twins of Zeus. Okay? Now in verse 12, it says, "And landing at Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. And from there we circled around and reached Rhegium." Now like I said, that's the sign of Rhegium. They're what you might call, a lot of places had emblems that represented their sort of tribe or whatever you want to call it, their community. Like today, like you'll see Mount Juliet's got the fancy MJ, for Mount Juliet, different things like that. Nashville's got, Music City, it's got a guitar and things like that. And then cities back then had similar things, and they used the twins sons of Zeus for their emblem of the city of Requiem. Now, it says, and stay there for 3 days. And from there we circled around and reached Rhegium. And after 1 day, the south wind blew. And the next day we came to Puteoli. So Puteoli would be the third line up there. As you can see on the way to Rome. Now you're going to ask, if you don't know your geography, well, how'd they get from the east side of Sicily over to the west side? There's a bay there. There's a gap. It's about 20 miles wide between Sicily and the boot heel of Italy. During World War II, the Allies made a big mistake by not closing this gap, and they let a lot of Germans escape off the island of Sicily into Italy. Instead of bottling them up on Sicily and forcing them to surrender, they wound up letting them get back into Italy and then having to fight them a second time. Conquerors in the past have not allowed this to happen, and why the Allies managed to do it during World War II, I have no idea, but they did. But there is a cut between Sicily and Italy, and then you go up the west coast of Italy when you go through that pass. It says the wind was blowing from the south. Okay, if you notice on this map, if it's blowing from the south, well, that's fine till you get to that cut, and then you got to go through that cut, and then you got to go north. Well, if they got a good south wind, that's no problem. But you have to remember the ships in those days didn't use, excuse me, ships in those days didn't use the square sails like you see on the sailing ships in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. They used triangular sails, okay? And they'd have several of them. So what does triangular sails do? They give you an advantage. You can sail into the wind with a triangular sail. You can turn it a certain way and the wind catches it, and by using the rudder and countermanding it, you can actually sail into the wind. That's the reason you see a lot of small sailboats with triangular sails. It's not because it is more convenient or more fitting, to the boat. It's the fact that it's more maneuverable than it would be with the big square sails. With the big square sails, you got what? One direction, right? That's all you got, it's one direction. So that the wind has to blow, and you have to be able to maneuver your ship in that to catch the wind to go just right in the direction you want to. But back then, they were a little smarter. They used the triangular sails and let them sail into the wind. And this is how they've gotten this far. It says, in landing at Syracuse, we stayed there 3 days. From there, we circled around and reached Rhegium, and then one day the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli. In verse 14 says, where we found brethren and were entreated to tarry with them 7 days, and so we came to Rome. Okay. Does something seem unusual about this? They're through sailing. They're on the mainland, and they're going to be traveling by land. Why would they stop for 7 days? Okay, this allowed Paul, possibly, to celebrate the Lord's Supper with the Christians. Where did these Christians come from? We don't know. No one had been there to evangelize them, but they were Christians. And they met Paul. They knew of Paul. And so the centurion that was in charge of him, Justus, he allowed Paul to stay there for 7 days and be with these Christians. Was this typical of a soldier to allow this, be this generous with Paul's time, with the timeline? Not really. A lot of people think, we don't know, it's all conjecture, But a lot of people think that the centurion was converted by Paul, because you look how much time he has spent with Paul. And he's seen Paul, first off, saved everybody on the ship. He worked miracles. He's done so many things. And he's taught Jesus, right? He's taught people about the Word of God. Now, just as it's been with him, he was chained to him. So what if he's chained to him? What does that mean? That he had to listen to all of this, and he allowed it. So why would a centurion of his rank, the emperor's guard, charged with the transport of this prisoner, be this generous to his prisoner if he was a pagan? Don't make sense, does it? We don't know. It's always a matter of opinion. But you got to believe that Paul had a great influence on this man. Whether he converted him or not, we don't know. But he had to have some kind of a powerful influence over his centurion. Okay. And verse 15, it says, "And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Epiphorum and 3 inns. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage." Okay, the market of Appius, very popular place. It was a very big market at the time. We think of markets as like the Quick Stop or something like that. But this is a marketplace where people for miles around came. There was booths. It was a big operation. It's like a giant craft fair. Giant fair. Has anybody ever been to the place up there just as you get off the interstate to go to Pigeon Forge? The big, what do you call it, flea market over there? The place is huge, isn't it? You could spend, 2 days there and not see it all. These marketplaces were similar to that, but they sold food, they sold clothing, they sold people, they sold spices, they sold jewels, everything you could imagine. You could go to these marketplaces, plus your pots, your pans, lanterns, all sorts of items that you would want. You would go to the marketplace to get it. No refrigeration, so what does that mean? If you wanted to eat meat, you went to the market every day and got your meat cut. You went to the market every day and got your bread baked. You went to the market every day and bought your food for that day. The women of the household, that's the way they did things at this time. No place to store it and keep it without it spoiling. Now, these people came, and they came a great distance. Now, we have to think about another thing, too. If you read the last chapter of Romans, it would be good to go with this lesson. Now, Paul was chained to a centurion. He's under arrest. He knew he was going to have to go to Rome, okay? Now, he had never met these Christians before. So what's it going to look like? What's the apprehension would be if you went to church somewhere that you'd never been to church before and you were chained to a policeman? You were in handcuffs. And you had to meet all the people from that congregation in handcuffs, being handcuffed to a policeman. Wouldn't it be kind of embarrassing? It'd be embarrassing, wouldn't it? Well, what's Paul? Paul has got to have some apprehension. Here he's chained or handcuffed to a policeman, to a centurion, and he's going to meet all these strange Christians that he had never met before. He doesn't know what kind of a reception he's going to receive, does he? So when he goes in and they express the true Christian attitude, what did they do? They embraced him, didn't they? They embraced him to the point that people were traveling 15, 25, 35 miles to come hear him speak while he's standing there chained to a centurion. Now, how many of us would flock to a congregation to hear someone speak handcuffed to a policeman? So it had to be an overwhelming gratitude on the behalf of Paul, right? To have this kind of a reception and to have this kind of opportunity. Plus, it shows another thing, how fast the Word of God spread. Now, this is 60 AD, okay? Jesus was executed, what, 33 AD, thereabouts. So you're talking about less than 30 years later, the Word of God had spread not only through the Middle East, but through Asia, Macedonia, and now all the way into Italy, down towards Sicily. The Word of God had spread in 30 years. Look how far it had spread. It just kept going, didn't it? And this was a modern day miracle almost in itself. Now I'm going to run through some slides here because I forgot to do it while I was talking. This is the island of Malta as you see it today. Picture of Paul when the viper come out and hooked on to his hand, and the people thought sure he was going to die. Now, there have been those in the theological community that say, oh, it wasn't a poisonous snake. But the way the word was written by Luke, and from the reaction of the people standing around, there's no doubt that it was a poisonous snake. Now, there's no snakes on Malta today. But if you figure for the last over 2,000 years, it's so densely populated today that there wouldn't be any room for snakes. They've killed them all off, you know. It's like Ireland. There were probably snakes there at one time, but they've all been killed off. And there's a picture of Paul healing Publius. And this is I couldn't find a good picture of the twins. This is one carving of what the twins would have looked like. Now, on the masthead of the ship, they wouldn't have been side by side. They'd have been facing in opposite directions, making sort of like a wedge. But this gives you an idea of what people back then had in a vision in their mind of what the twins of Zeus looked like. And of course, this is the market of Appius. And then we're going to find out that he's going to travel to 3 taverns next. And this is a picture of 3 taverns on the right. And the picture of Appius on the left. Now, these are pictures of ruins, but it gives you some idea of how big these cities were, because there's temples. Notice the temples there. So that's an indication of, because of the size of them, that these were wealthy and well-populated cities, weren't they? And we're going to stop right there, and then we're going to finish the book of Acts next week. Any questions or comments? Remind me not to sleep with the window open next week.